Good morning and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheist, agnostic, skeptic, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be good to all conscious beings, and we believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you are probably in the right place. So the way that we do it is the members ourselves give the talks, and then afterwards we get into a discussion circle and have a discussion. Everyone is invited to the planning meetings, and we accept donations. We use the donations to pay for the renting of the room. So if you'd like to give a donation, there is a jar at the back of the room, or you can do it on meetup.com. Do we have any events coming up really soon? We have a few weeks before we have events come in. I don't think there's anything other than we have it every Sunday, so see it at Sunday at noon. And then third Saturday of the month, we have our secular social, which we just had. That's at Browers. Please plan to join us. And also, we have our second Sunday of the month, we have board games at Wayward Coffee House after church. So if you'd like to join at one of those things, just let somebody know. Without further ado, Brian, come on up.
Thank you, everyone. This is my first time speaking here, so please be gentle, and also thank you for the opportunity to speak. So my name's Brian, and so leading up to this talk, one thing that's very memorable for me about growing up in a Midwestern town that was very dominantly Christian was the question, what church do you go to, kind of being like a showstopper and social introductions for me, because my family wasn't religious and we didn't go to church. And I also, another thing that's very memorable to me as a bi man in the queer community is also kind of feeling like you don't necessarily count or fit in because people assume everyone is gay, or people might also assume everyone is a gay man, and so women, lesbians, bi, trans people, and so on are often left out. So that's one reason why I personally like the label queer for the community instead of acronym-based things, because I kind of feel like it puts everybody on more of an even level, and it's more inclusive. So I'll use that term throughout the talk, and if you're not familiar with that, you can think of it as standing in for LGBTQ and so on. And so that I mentioned these kind of feelings of being not quite fully a member of the community or being left out, because that was what captured my interest when I was listening to a recent Slate podcast, which was a podcast they produced called Outward, and they had a recent episode called The Freedom and Magic of Queer Spirituality. And one of the topics that they discussed in the podcast was an article that had recently come out in a publication called Them, which was titled Meet the Queer Skeptics Who Hate Astrology, and the subtitle is Not All Queer People Believe in Astrology, and those who don't often feel alienated from the LGBTQ plus community at large. And so that resonated with me and kind of piqued my interest. And apparently, as quoted in the article here, some people have felt that interest in astrology in particular within the queer community has become, quote, completely hegemonic to a degree that people who identify as skeptics feel left out or shamed or judged, or that they're not sufficiently queer because they're not interested in this or even reject it. And it's become so frustrating for some people that this article came out, and it's actually seeming to be kind of a cultural phenomenon recently that this is going on. So this is very interesting to me because I said it resonated with previous experiences I have. In my travels in my corners of the queer community, have encountered various forms of woo, but never to such a degree where it felt suffocating or overwhelming, like is described here. So it's kind of confirming things I'd seen a little bit, but to a degree to which it seemed alarming. And so that kind of captured my interest and motivated looking into this further for the talk, because I thought it might be interesting to unpack and explore and learn more about what's going on here. And in fact, many of the people quoted in the article were not willing to have their names published because they were apparently fearing retribution or stigma or being shamed. And one queer studies professor who did use her name said that she perceives mentioning her own non-belief in astrology or non-practice of astrology-related practices would be perceived as hate speech by her college students that she's teaching, so she feels the need to conceal it and keep it to herself. And so remembering, what's your church making me feel uncomfortable is what's your sign, a new version of this in a different context. And then are we replicating bad behavior that we've had inflicted on us by others within the Sistani community? Is this a real thing going on? Because I have never felt particularly oppressed by astrology, but maybe I'm just not traveling in certain circles. Maybe I've been out of college for a few years and I haven't traveled around very much. Maybe it has something to do with my gender or some other aspect of myself where it hasn't been visible to me. And certainly there's a history of forms of discrimination being reproduced within the queer community, such as racism, sexism, transphobia, and so on, that I want to acknowledge as well as obviously being very serious in this talk. And so I was wondering, given all this, is this something that's very widespread? And do we need to declare a moral panic? I wanted to understand a little bit more about what astrology is to kind of start investigating this more and understanding it. And how did it come to be associated with queer spaces and queer people? And so a little brief history of it, and there's probably important aspects of this that I've neglected to learn about. So if somebody knows more and wants to share during discussion, I would certainly invite that. So it's a very ancient practice, and so it has to do with understanding how the movements of bodies in the heavens, such as the moon and the sun and the planets, might influence human events on an individual level, such as your personality, or events that might happen to you, such as luck or good fortune or disease, as well as those things kind of extrapolated to civilizations as a whole. And so there have been forms of it in India, China, and the Mayans. And Western astrology, which is kind of the part, or the branch of it that is relevant for this discussion, goes all the way back to the Babylonians. And so I was interested to learn, so they were aware of planets and they were actually quite preoccupied with understanding their movements. They had identified certain planets as representing certain gods to them, and so they wanted to understand and even predict the movements of the planets and interpret them in a way to kind of know what they should do to please the gods. And so, over several centuries, and this is between 2000 BC and on, they got better at predicting the motions of the planets, which is actually mathematically very interesting. They developed a lot of mathematics in order to do this. And they went from being able to predict events a short time in advance to longer and longer times in advance. And this would be phases of the moon, predicting eclipses, rising and setting of stars over the horizon at night, and other things like that. And of course, these things are related to seasons. And so one example would be, you can predict the passing of the seasons by looking at these things. And there's a link between what's going on in the stars and what's going on Earth. And so maybe the same logic applies to people and politics and so on. And one thing that I found interesting about this, and this kind of seems to start a thread that goes through astrology and the particular properties of it, is as they got very good at predicting these things, it kind of gave them this power to predict what the gods were going to ask for, in the future. And so they seemed okay with that as an idea where it was just kind of like, you have a good manager who's clear about their expectations and you just have to do that. It's not mysterious. You can know what they're going to want you to do later. And they would even, there were written records of Babylonian priests kind of saying like, hey, we looked at the planets and the gods are going to want the king to do this, after the eclipse happens. And so don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. I'll pretend to be the king for purposes of, fulfilling the technicality, and I'll go do the thing and it'll be fine. And so there was kind of this interesting view of it where there wasn't really a lot of agency in the gods. It was just somehow predictable and coming down. And so that came through the Greeks. And so they also developed astronomy and astrology kind of together. In particular, Ptolemy had a geocentric model of the universe where the Earth is at the middle, and then the moon and the planets and the sun are moving on these concentric spheres. And by modeling kind of contrived combinations of spheres. You can predict the motions of the planets, even though that's not physically what's happening. It kind of served as a useful model, although they seem to think that that was actually what was happening. One thing that's interesting is that the scale of the solar system in that view was very small compared to like the physical scale. Like if you held a meter stick up to it, it was very small compared to what we know it is. So he computed that the distance from the Earth to the Sun was about 1,200 times the radius of the Earth, and that's about 5% of the true distance. So it's kind of this very compact version of it. In fact, determining the scale of things, like what's the mass of the Earth, what's the distance from the Earth to the Sun, was something that was very challenging in the history of science and motivated a lot of development there. And so coming back to astrology a little bit, one thing to be aware of is just in the geometry of the solar system, things are approximately in a plane called the ecliptic. So even though space is three-dimensional, things are kind of flying around more or less in a plane. And obviously things are, orbits can be tilted around that, but that's the general idea. And so taking this geocentric view, where the Earth is at the middle, and all the other bodies, such as the Sun and Mars, are moving around it, if you imagine looking from the Earth out towards an object, say Mars, then you would see behind it there would be a particular constellation on this fixed sphere of stars. And that got divided, kind of like the hours of a clock, into these 12 constellations, which are what people commonly knows these astrological signs. But these are kind of just saying, from this angle to this angle is Taurus, and from this angle to this angle is Gemini. And so based on that, these things started having associations with particular personality traits and other things. And so when people use the term horoscope, apparently, so I think popularly this is kind of like an advice column in the newspaper would be, oh, if your sign is Leo, which is mine, then you'll have good luck today, but don't have surgery or something, would be advice. But really the horoscope is kind of this drawing of the geometry of all the planets that can actually have a physical basis, right? It's just a geometry problem. You can observe them with telescopes, and you can say, okay, if I look at Mars from Earth, this is what is behind it, right? But then that goes through this interpretive process by an astrologer who combines all these kind of cultural things, and one way to look at it is that they're essentially randomly assigning traits and fortunes to people with this position of the planets as a random seed. And that would be kind of a modern view, is you just kind of get random things assigned to you. And it can get very complex. But just to briefly understand the relationship with the planets, the common thing, like if you say you're a Leo, that means when you were born, looking from the Earth at the Sun, behind the Sun is a particular constellation. And so you can imagine you could look at other bodies and get other things, and there are other geometric things related to when things are near each other or angles, and so it's like this endlessly complicated raw material that's kind of random, but cyclical, that people will make these things up on. And in the history in Europe, it was quite popular or widespread in medieval Europe. In certain times and places, doctors practicing medicine were required to kind of do a check before doing surgery to make sure it was well advised. It was actually, it was still kind of entangled with astronomy, which is the modern science. It was one of the original liberal arts that were practiced or taught in universities. It's obviously featured in a lot of Western literature, but it's really rooted in this geocentric view of the world. And so as the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment kind of got going, and the heliocentric view of the world came in, that served a lot to discredit astrology. So it stopped being taken very seriously and kind of became considered a pseudoscience. But this was actually relatively late, like 1500s and so on. And so one interesting thing about astrology too is it gets at what is the difference between pseudoscience and science. And astrology is interesting because depending on how you look at it and how the claims are being made, the claims are either so vague as to be unfalsifiable, or they are concrete enough where you can falsify them, and when that's been done, they have been falsified. Like the predictions are essentially random. And so this then, after being kind of discredited, it was still part of culture. And in the 1970s, during the New Age movement, it kind of had a bringing back into our popular culture. And in fact, the term New Age movement is related to the age of Aquarius, which is an astrological related term. So it's not tangential that it's related, it's very closely in there. And one interesting aspect of this when I was learning about what it means to be the age of Aquarius is this has to do with the precession of the equinox, and it has to do with the Earth's axis slowly precessing like a top, which takes about 26,000 years, and this is a real physical phenomenon that happens. And what this, one thing that this means is over time, the relationship of what season it is versus when you're, say, born a Leo or a certain other sign will shift over time, which is one interesting thing to keep in mind when you say, like, maybe people born in the summer or the winter might have different personality traits, and there might be, might be some basis for initially believing in astrology. Another thing that I found interesting about it is that this boundary is not very well defined. So the 12 constellations that are kind of separating out these different signs are not, there's not like a clear boundary that's even like the hours of a clock. It's a little murky, like where you draw the boundary, and they're not all the same size. And so there's actually debate over when this age of Aquarius would begin, you know, plus or minus a few hundred years. And so that's been something that there's disagreement about. And this age has come to kind of represent to people the previous age, apparently, generally speaking, is kind of representing spiritual decline, and this dawning of the new age would represent whatever people would want to have hope for the future or think the future is going. So it kind of represents things to different people. But it'd be some end of this, you know, spiritually deficient period of time. And so I found in reading, so this New Age movement was entangled with counterculture and feminist movements and queer movements in ways that are very complicated and historically rich, and I don't understand very well, so I don't want to try to unpack or explain the details of it other than to just say that those are related. And so one thing that I found when I was reading more about this too is that there might be a gendered component to this, and so perhaps that's one reason why in my social circles I haven't encountered this very much. But perhaps it's also just practiced in small communities where it happens to be popularized by somebody who's influential. I don't really know. But those are all good questions. One thing I wanted to know is how prevalent is belief in astrology in general, and is this something that is gendered? And so I found this article from the Astronomy Education Review. So this is from 2011. And so this is surveying undergraduate students at a large public American university. And so they surveyed 10,000 undergraduate students over a 20-year period, so roughly from 1990 until 2010, you know, plus or minus a few years. And so there's in astrology, or excuse me, in astronomy, the science education, there's some concern that belief in astrology, the pseudoscience, is an indicator of both lack of scientific literacy. And so they wanted to understand how prevalent this is. Is it really true that it's predictive of scientific literacy if you do or do not believe in astrology? But first, they actually have a really good introduction that explains some of the reasons why astrology is popular. And so they say astrology is pervasive in Western society. You can see it in various newspapers. And so they're interested in answering these questions about scientific literacy and science education around pseudosciences. And so one of the frequently cited reasons for believing in astrology is this so-called Barnum effect, where if you generate kind of vague descriptions of a person, people will tend to think that they apply to them more than you would expect based on random chance. You know, and they give an example of such a statement, which is at times you are sociable, while at other times you are reserved. And most people would probably say, yeah, that sounds good. That's accurate. And then there are lots of interesting things that come around in these kinds of statements. So believers in astrology are more likely to accept any type of personality description as accurate, regardless of if it's positive or negative. Skeptics, however, will also fall prey to this effect, especially if the personality descriptions are positive. And in fact, when I read some there's an app that will give you these predictions where the role of the astrologer is replaced by AI. And it seems to give positive things. And when I first read it, I was like, wow, I can see why this would appeal to people, because it's flattering, it kind of feels like it applies. Like, you know, I didn't believe that it was real, but I can see the feeling. And in fact, and this isn't given, and skeptics who are given flattering horoscopes increase their favorable attitudes toward astrology. And there are other, this isn't quoted in this paper, but there were other things where people will, if the person giving the description has social status or authority, they're more likely to believe it, and so on. So it gets entangled in all these kinds of things. And this gets into various cognitive biases that people have. And there's also a lot of evidence that people will seek out astrology to try to explain life events or predict the future when there's been a trauma in their lives or for society. And in fact, there have been studies in Germany in between the two world wars, which obviously would have been a traumatic period in Germany. There was a lot of interest in astrology, and in the US in the Great Depression. And in fact, one of the things I found too when reading it is there seems to be, at least in pop culture, a resurgence of interest in astrology in recent years. So perhaps there's some kind of national trauma that's come about recently. If anybody knows what that is, let me know. And so this is kind of a response to trauma, and people also use it because it provides an illusion of control, and so on. And so this article also goes through some information about who's interested in astrology, and it does break it down by gender, which was interesting. And so the questions that they ask, and this is important to know exactly how the questions are phrased. The first one is, would you say that astrology is very, sort of, or not at all scientific? And about 75 to 80% of people say that it is very or sort of scientific. And this is, university undergraduate students kind of at the beginning of a science course. And then another question that they ask, and here they're deliberately not using the word astrology because they don't want to have the potential that students could get confused about astrology versus astronomy. So what they ask is, the positions of the planets have an influence on the events of everyday life. And this broke down about 40% of the students agree or strongly agree that the planets influence everyday life, and about 30% strongly disagreed or disagreed, and about 30% had no opinion. And they found a modest but statistically significant difference between men and women responding, but just a few percent. So not a huge, overwhelming difference in it, but a small one. And then they also study, does this belief in astrology kind of close people off to learning about scientific things, or does it inhibit scientific literacy? And they found that it doesn't. And students who initially believed in astrology can, through further science education, gain greater scientific literacy, and it doesn't necessarily preclude scientific literacy. So the takeaway is kind of like, maybe don't worry about astrology as much as certain other things. Maybe it's kind of something to kind of fill a space, and rather than trying to fight astrology itself, you might be better off just addressing science and teaching that, which I thought was interesting. And that's one reason why I'm going to avoid, as much as possible in this talk, kind of mocking or poking fun at astrology. And there's a lot in here. They compare it to belief in other pseudosciences. Just for fun, the other pseudoscience-related beliefs that they compare it with are faith healing is a valid alternative to conventional medicine. Some numbers are especially lucky for some people. The positions of the planets have an influence on the day of everyday life, which is the astrology one. The phenomena that physical science, or there are phenomena that physical science and the laws of nature cannot explain. Some people possess psychic powers, and some ancient civilizations were visited by extraterrestrials. And there's further numbers in there. But the conclusion is basically belief in astrology does not imply poor scientific literacy necessarily, which is interesting. So maybe we don't need to freak out about it as much. Maybe there are bigger fish to fry. And some of the other, so there were some other pop cultural, less academic articles that I found. So one of them is kind of millennial oriented, and so this is from very recently, about a year ago in 2018. So remember this study that I was looking at before was from 2011. back in the before times. And so this is basically saying that there's a renewed interest in astrology generally. Perhaps this is a response to national trauma or uncertainty. And some of the reasons given for the renewed interest are it's a response to stress, it provides a comfort for a better future, because you can kind of picture, oh, in 6 months it says I'll have a year where I'll have excellent good luck. So they give one example of a person who made a point to kind of improve their life so they would be ready to take advantage of that period of time. It emphasizes the transience of events, things are cycles, this will pass, and so on. It provides an open-ended frame to kind of create a narrative about yourself and others in world events. And so it might be kind of a cognitive technique to kind of just start with like in like a computer algorithm, you can start with a random seed and then see how well it fits, and you can kind of reject parts that don't and keep the ones that do, so it can just be an initial starting point. And it provides kind of an illusion of control and understanding, which can feel good. And there's a distinction between kind of use as a tool or because it's fun versus really believing in it. And so that's very common in these discussions. People say, no, I don't really believe that it's a real thing. Like obviously Mars is not influencing me, but it still provides utility to me, so I'll use it that way. Horoscopes that have become political, where they interpret results in a political context, like a Trump-related context, have apparently become much more popular in recent years, whereas before they would stay more vague. So that might tell you one dimension of the interest in it. And then they also say, people saying one reason why it's resurging, or one consequence of that, is that in society, this particular person who's quoted says it's less acceptable to kind of dump on things that aren't rational, or saying things are stupid because they're not a fact. And so that might be a consequence of this, or it might be a cause, I don't know, but norms around criticizing things as not being rational have changed, and it can be kind of a reaction to against rationality or technology or so on. And there have been, in history, reactions to, different changes in understanding of the world. You can lead to, movements in arts that are reacting to that. And so, coming back to the original article, though, obviously there are people who are not happy about this, particularly in the queer community in this article that originally started this. And so some of the harms that they articulate that they're experiencing are exclusion and judgment. And one aspect of astrology that I think contributes to that is that it's kind of preoccupied with compatibility with other people and kind of filtering people into different categories and saying like, oh, you're a this, so we don't get along, and that kind of thing. And so I think that might be one aspect of it that leads to toxicity. One other property of it is even if you're not a participant in it, you still have a horoscope. If people know, for example, your birthday, it applies to you. So you can't ask somebody who's not religious necessarily, who's your favorite saint, but you can ask, what's your sign? And in the mathematical sense, that like even numbers exist, like your astrological sign exists, like you can go look up what it is, even if it's meaningless. So it kind of has this boundless property to it. Some other harms, and we've talked about harms of woo before, and so those all apply to this too, is that it might be detrimental to scientific advancement, or in particular, it might be dangerous for misunderstood groups like the queer community to use pseudoscientific epistemology. And it might be because we could become more vulnerable to being taken advantage of or be misperceived. Some people said that the focus on the inner self, and these are mostly quotes, is a distraction from very real systemic assaults. And they likened it to the use of prayer to avoid taking meaningful action. And avoiding answers instead of seeking solutions, and hiding behind astrology rather than engaging with the world. And so I think these are all things that I relate to, having experienced other kind of dominant religious or spiritual movements and not being a part of it. There's also an angle of critique of astrology that they bring up, and there's in fact a whole academic discipline of queer astrology. And a lot of what they focus on is, if you look at the history of astrology, there's a lot of stereotypes that are associated with different signs. So a lot of the things are gendered, and a lot of the ones that are feminine aren't particularly flattering. And there's also other stereotypes in there, and there's also critiques that it is essentially a form of cultural appropriation to do these astrological practices. And so they also bring this up. Sorry, I'm becoming nervous. Anyway, as a critique. And so there's kind of this rich list of harms that people are articulating. And in fact, people who identify as queer skeptics, who are skeptics in the queer community, the article in the end kind of says there are 3 ways that they are responding to it. One would be to spend more time in non-queer skeptical spaces, for example, this space. And so that seemed interesting to me. One was to participate actively in, quote, anti-woo or pro-science causes. And then another technique is just to kind of tolerate the behavior and just accept it as a part of life and participate. And so obviously people will, or without participating individually, but kind of allowing it to go on and just worrying about other things. And so obviously people might mix all these responses. And so this first response to kind of find skeptical spaces and kind of make them into a queer skeptical space was something that was interesting to me, because I actually found this space also in reaction to changes in our society and politics after 2016 and the election of Trump. And so my interests were to try to find a space where there was face-to-face interaction, and I wasn't motivated by fleeing spirituality or woo in another space, but there's still some common cause of changes or trauma in society that I relate to. And so I think understanding this, this is kind of a particular cultural phenomenon of this moment, and we should be sensitive to the fact that this is going on when we relate to others. And so I would propose, while we should certainly avoid woo and not practice woo ourselves, we should maybe spend more time talking positively about science rather than negatively or mockingly about woo, particularly about astrology-related woo. Maybe other forms of woo have different qualities, but it seems like astrology in particular is kind of a placeholder for whatever people want, and if you provide something else, it can kind of be displaced. And then in general, I think avoiding emphasizing compatibility or incompatibility between individuals or groups would be a behavior to avoid engaging in ourselves, because we've seen that can become toxic and deeply unpleasant. And so as we're doing that, for example, I wouldn't want to exclude somebody because they maybe, casually experimented with astrology in college or something. And in fact, I think it might be good to try to reach out to people who might feel dissatisfied with what they're getting in queer spaces and say, hey, here we are, we exist, you're welcome. And in fact, there's quite a few queer people here. And that's something that I've enjoyed quite a bit. And so obviously my slice of experience is limited and narrow, and I don't know everything about all corners of society, and so I'm very interested in hearing other people's individual experiences with this during the discussion or debating it. Sorry if I've been a little nervous, I haven't done a big public speech in a while. Yeah, so that concludes my talk. Thank you so much.